Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of Bag Biography, the longest running seminar series at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, and might be getting close to being one of the longest ones in the United States or the world, considering Professor Hoffenberg's talk today is going to be number 767. These have been going since the mid-1980s. They were originally the idea of the director emeritus of the center, George Simpson, who created the center and also the journal Biography, and also created this series. It's being very, very ably run by Zoe Sprout, who's the graduate assistant associated with the Center for Biographical Research, and Paige Rasmussen, who is the managing editor for the journal Biography and the manager of the center. And I'd like to thank all of them. Before I introduce our speaker today, I just want to mention a couple of things. First of all, this is the last one of our brown bags for this particular semester. It's been an interesting semester, to say the least. We've all had to switch over into a different mode, but one of the ironies that has come up is that when we stopped in mid-March doing the brown bags and had to cancel the rest of the semester, we decided we really needed to do something in the fall. So we did. We put together a full roster, realized it would have to all be virtual, and we'll just see what we've gone. And in dealing with it, we've been able to have the full roster, and we have also found out that on average, the number of attendees is anywhere from 50% to 200% higher. And we're also getting people logging in for the events all around the world. So it's actually been something, as many of us have been seeing, is that when we actually hopefully go back to more contact with other people, we will probably still keep a Zoom component because it's allowed us to have a whole other audience to these kind of events. And a lot of that has been the result of Zoe's work in setting this up, and I'd just like to thank her again for that. If you are interested in finding out, because we are putting a full roster together for the spring, there will be 14 or 15 brown bag talks. What you can do is, if you would like to get regular information about that, what you can do is that Zoe will be putting in the chat box the way that you can contact and get put onto Facebook or onto our general mailing list and whatever. So Zoe will be putting that information up there as well. And we're looking very much forward to another session in the spring. Okay. And now it gives me pleasure to introduce our speaker today. One final thing, though, I should mention, which is that in this environment, there are a number of things that came up that we would have never imagined otherwise. One of them has to do with just overall security in images and various things. People have been photobombed and worse in various situations, especially in these kind of seminars. So when we get to the question and answer section, what we're going to do is ask that you put your questions into the chat box, and then I will pass them over to Professor Hoffenberg, and he will then be able to answer them from there. We're still working out the logistics of how to handle those issues of security. And that seems to work best for us, and it's worked well for the rest of the semester. Okay. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter H. Hoffenberg, who's an associate professor of history at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, where he teaches courses in the histories of early modern and modern Britain, the British Empire and the Commonwealth, and the world since 1500, and economic thought and European film, broad and wide interests. He is the author of A Science of Our Own, Exhibitions and the Rise of Australian Public Science, 1851 to 1888, from the University of Pittsburgh Press for 2019, which was published as a volume in the Science and Culture in the 19th Century series. And then also An Empire on Display, English, Indian, and Australian Exhibitions from the Crystal Palace to the Great War, which was University of California Press 2001. And he's also published articles and book chapters on topics including traditional Indian art, John Lockwood Kipling, and the history of Australian science. Today's talk is the first baby step in a project to better understand the early career and public life of Sir George Birdwood, 1832 to 1917, who Professor Hoffenberg met which I'm going to be very interested to hear what he has to say about meeting Birdwood, and studied in light of his projects at the India office and with the Journal of Indian Art and Industry, after Birdwood had returned to London in the later 1860s. And he's going to pose a number of questions in relation to that. Before he starts, though, I just wanted to mention a couple of other things. Peter has also been very visible as a proponent and a supporter and a facilitator for Victorian studies more generally at the university. He's been on the organization and planning committees of a number of the major conferences that have brought regional and national Victorian and 19th century studies conferences here. He's also been involved in the preparation and editorship of collections that have emerged from those. And he has also been the support and the sponsor for visiting scholars who have been here that he has. So as a proponent for somebody, for people doing work in the Pacific that is tied to Victorian issues, Peter has been a major connection and a major supporter of that work, which you can also see in his own work. The second thing I just wanted to mention in that broader range as well too, is that his involvement with the Sidney Stern Foundation has also meant the funding of a whole range of activities, not necessarily related to Victorian England, but which are of public and intellectual interest. It has become one of the really important funders of humanities, education, and conversation in the state of Hawaii. So Peter does a variety of things, and I'm just wanting to suggest that we should thank him for not only the talk he's going to give today, but the kind of contributions he's been making to Hawaii and the field of Victorian studies over the years. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter Hoffenberg.
Thank you very much. It's very, very kind, and I hope you feel the same way after today's talk, after 40 minutes. If you don't, then you can just refer to what Craig said before and forget about the talk itself. Anyhow, thank you very much. I know it's a rather fraught time at the end of the term, and Zoom, etc., as a challenge. So I really very much appreciate your time today. Please note that I'm more than happy to make the formal talk available. I thought a more conversational talk would work better today. So please also feel free to interrupt me, ask questions, etc. The talk will focus around a series of illustrations. So if my comments send you very, very far away and nearly into sleep, perhaps the illustrations can at least focus our conversation. As Craig mentioned, this is the first step. It almost isn't even a baby step to try to understand an individual who I met, as Craig said, and we can use the term meet loosely in our pandemic world, who I was introduced to, studied, was a focus of some of my other interests, as he was well known. And if I can get the first illustration put up, we can talk about his being very well known. And that is Sir George Birdwood. Between 1832 and 1917, a relatively easy bookend set of dates. 1832, the Great Reform Bill, and one could argue the true birth of Victorian Britain. 1917, as the Brits and much of Europe are immersed in the carnage of the Great War, perhaps the end of the Victorian age. 1832 to 1917 would even today be a good, solid, long life. And it was for George Birdwood. The Birdwood we know, the one illustrated here, is the Birdwood after 1868, when facing illness, he left Bombay, or Mumbai. I'll refer to it today as Bombay, since that's the literature of the time period. But of course, it is the Mumbai we very well know today. And if you're interested in his studies in relationship to the city itself, obviously more contemporary works would refer to Mumbai rather than to Bombay. He left in 1868 to a great acclaim on the part of Anglo-Indians, Europeans, and of particular interest to me, a large collection of South Asians. He left in 1868 to become the Birdwood you see here. The next 40 to 50 years, he was among the leading Orientalists, and many of you are familiar in one way or another with Said's work on Orientalism. So here is a practical poster child for Orientalism. He worked at the India office, specifically promoting traditional Indian art. He would not have used the word art. He would have said industrial arts or art wares. That work also included continuing his scientific work, particularly in botany. He was present as far as exhibitions. And also he became the go-to person for Indian questions or Indian affairs at the Royal Society of Arts. That meant that he gave talks there, but it also meant that he was an active member of the audience. And it is impossible to go through the journal of the Royal Society of Arts from the mid to late 1870s until a couple years even after his passing without seeing his name mentioned as attending, giving a talk, sponsoring, etc. So this is the Birdwood of, one could say, a rather elite, intellectual, learned community. A community of Orientalist congresses, such as one he attended in 1874, a community in which authors published in the Athenaeum, the Quarterly Review, the Times, and by 1917, he's also known as a co-sponsor of Primrose Day, which was honored the celebration of Disraeli's birth. So he's a known commodity. Would we put him up with prime ministers? Probably not, but we would put him up with having a significant number of columns in the 1920 edition of the Dictionary of National Biography, the Mount Rushmore, if you will, for men and now, of course, women as well in British history and British public life. All good, all solid, all recognized. But I was intrigued after knowing and spending time with this Birdwood. What was the Birdwood before he was Sir George? What was the Birdwood before the Royal Society? Before these rather high altitude discussions and jousts and debates in the Times? So if we could turn to the second image, please. I would like to introduce the Birdwood who most interests me. This is the Birdwood upon his arrival back in England. And I say back in England because all of you well know that as the son of an Anglo-Indian, he was educated back in the British Isles. So while born near Bombay, he spends the typical Kipling-esque and almost every other character we can think of in school back in Britain, and that includes the University of Edinburgh for a medical degree. So the Birdwood we meet today is the Birdwood behind this image. All three parts of the caption are important. The MD. So one would say, what's going on here? This is Birdwood, who's known for traditional arts, for talking about pottery. This is the Birdwood who's known for advocating the social roles of caste in the village community. This does not seem to be a medical Birdwood. So among my interests is pursuing his understanding of what we call a medical taxonomy for the world, which far be from me to claim any kind of expertise, but I know some of the audience do, a medical discourse. I'm using the word with trepidation, not because it's necessarily incorrect, but because I really don't have the intellectual tools to use it properly. But this screamed out at me as I thought about his years and how the years really begin and end with a medical experience, medical training, being on the shipboard of a medical vessel during the Persian War, being responsible for a professorship at the medical college. And one of the issues that I want to deal with in the work is the impact and endurance of the medical approach to understanding and labeling the physical world, to categorizing the physical world, but also making the physical world accessible to the public. So my phrase for that is public science. That's what I've worked on as far as Australia. And my initial contention is that, in fact, even though the subjects change to art, traditional India, village community, the approach still remains the medical approach. So that's one significant arc in my studies, is the contention that the medical view continues and links the Bombay Birdwood with the later Birdwood. The second, CSI, which I know sounds like a popular television show about detectives and investigating crimes, is, as Ned and others will recognize, one of the many neo-Gothic orders that seem to populate the Victorian world. We think about the Major Joust at Edgeworth. We can think about the Durbars, which Kipling's father ornamented with pseudo-medieval signs and tents. Well, this is the Star of India, and he was a companion of the Star of India, which at the very least suggests a recognized public role in Anglo-India, and probably a clear relationship with the governor, who I'll talk about in a minute, Sir Bartle Frere. The last, of course, is that unlike so many folks who leave a position for ill health and travel thousands of miles to unemployment, he picked up a job readily with the India office. The India office position was a seemingly, again, Victorian revenue, statistics, and commerce department, special assistant to that department. You could think of that as the part of the India office which is so fascinated with the physical world that it not only studies that physical world, writes about it, categorizes it, labels it, but also finds a commercial value for it. So we look at medicinal plants, for example, or medicinal oils. The later Birdwood would say, well, let's promote Indian artwares and let's sell them. So the commercial aspect, the money-making aspect we'll see, will also be very important for Birdwood. What did he do during the time in Bombay that at least is apparent for somebody like myself who has had to rely on non-archival sources? So obviously with the pandemic, I've relied very heavily on Hattie Trust, and I'm very thankful for Hamilton Library to making that accessible. I've relied on some other published works and a few archival sources here and there, which I collected earlier. But one of the major pukas, and why much of the conversation today is raising questions and thinking about the questions, but not necessarily being able to answer them, is the real lack of archival materials. So I have enough to start. I have enough to put the frame of the house together, but the archival materials which provide the food and the refrigerator and the furniture and the carpeting, I really don't yet have. Having said that, what did he do between 1854 and 1868 when he returned to Bombay? There is almost a public institutional checklist, which he ended up in one way or another filling almost every position in those institutions as either a secretary, and please think of the secretary as, in this case, a Victorian secretary who's responsible for overseeing the board, implementing policy, publishing works, or an honorary secretary, or a management committee member of the three significant non-literary learned societies. So what do I mean by non-literary? So as we know, the British Empire was populated with branches, for example, of the Royal Asiatic Society. So we could check that one off. He, in fact, was secretary of the branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. Many major colonies, if not nearly all, had some kind of agro-horticulture society. We can check that one off for Birdwood. Many of them had representatives of the Geographical Society. We could connect that off. So he linked all three, cross-fertilized the work in all three, participated with fellow Anglo-Indians and prominent South Asians in all three. But there were two areas which some of his colleagues might have participated in, but he did not. And some of the folks I compare him with in other colonies did participate in, but he did not. And the two main areas I think of immediately would be a literary society. So Madras, Sydney, you name it, had some kind of a literary society. He didn't participate in that. And then ironically, he really was not interested in art. Now we think about his expertise in art industry and art wares, but here's an early example of that bifurcation, which was so significant in the study of India between Indian fine arts and Indian practical arts. So early on, we see the seed of really not much interest at all in Indian fine arts, painting, sculpture, etc., but interest in the Indian commercial arts. He also helped create the university, and I hope all of us have a chance to visit Mumbai, and probably Ned has been several times, and you can see a bust to him in the university. And every year, some folks honor his birthday by going to that bust and put a garland of flowers around. He was a registrar. He participated as the first curator for the museum, and as a curator for the museum, also helped organize the Victoria Gardens. And I'll show you pictures of those later on. So I think it's fair to say that in his 14 years, he himself would have thought he led a rich public life, and clearly those around him also. So when we go through the society journals, I've done what I can with the Bombay Gazette. I apologize. I haven't been able to go through as much as I would like. We see not only does he think of himself as a public figure, but others do as well. So when he leaves in 1868, there's a large outpouring of, yes, on one hand, performative, formal, to be expected accolades, but they do go on, and they are expressed by so many different people in various different ways that it'd be snarky as a historian to just dismiss them as performative. In other words, there was a bond, there was a social bond. So one of the questions that comes out of this is, why did people later on not really give much credence to this? When we look at the Dictionary of National Biography, when we look at the other official or semi-official Indian or Anglo-Indian biographies, there's a rich description of what he did after he got back to London. But much of the other early work is either dismissed or given sort of a gesture, like something like a sentence in which he was the secretary to a significant number of learned societies. So to paraphrase Edward Palmer Thompson, I suppose I'm trying to rescue this part of Birdwood's life from the condescension of posterity, as Edward used to say about the craftsmen and artisans of 18th century England in particular. In doing so, I'm trying to ask a question that might be of interest to folks who study life writing, as Craig explained it to me a couple weeks ago, why this chapter just doesn't seem to play a role in that life writing. And then finally, giving some credence to this period, what are some of the connections that we might make both to the later period in his life and to the broader studies of, for want of a better word, I think, colonial knowledge, colonial public life, colonial cultural institutions. So I've suggested one of those links, which is to ask about the mathematical approach and how medicine, I apologize, how medicine might have influenced his view of the world. It was shared by many of his colleagues, Hunter, Watson, Royal in places like Madras and London, who also were all trained in medicine, and then for one reason or another turned to cataloging the sciences, natural history, and also art. So if I could see the third image, please. Thank you. So if one of the arcs is to connect the two parts, and that one of the streams on that arc is this question of medicine. Another question I'm interested in is, to steal a phrase from the press, a potentially special relationship between Birdwood, as one might think of as influential, yet not a public office holder, and the figure most clearly associated with the explosion of public life and public structures in mid-Victorian Bombay, and that's Sir Henry Bartle Frere. Many of you will know of him from another portion of his career, which was in South Africa, where he was intimately involved in the very controversial Anglo-Zulu War of the late 1870s. And Frere, like many others, both in the French and British empires, traveled from post to post. This was their lifetime employment in a large corporation, and they went from office to office. Between 1862 and 1867, Frere was the governor in Bombay. So I am interested in what this relationship was like in a working way. So we'll see Frere mention Birdwood, for example. We'll see them together in engravings like the last one I'll show you before we get to the more formal questions. But I want to look more closely at this. One reason to do so is this is a relationship which seems rather powerfully replicated throughout the British world. And what I mean by that, and I try not to banal about it, is a key cultural figure like Sir Henry Cole in London, who really can only do what he wants when he has a special relationship with a leading political figure. So the relationship which is most obvious to all of us is Prince Albert and Sir Henry Cole. I want to see how those kinds of relationships might be replicated in the sense of a public culture or a public science, which is not actually embedded in the state or the government, but has some very important personal and institutional connections to it. And it seems to me that pursuing Frere and Birdwood's relationship can help me think about those in light of a relationship I know pretty well, which is Cole and Albert, and compare it to another relationship that I've become rather intimate with, and that's the one in Melbourne with Sir Edmund Barry, who is, importantly, both a cultural figure and a political figure. So I'm interested in what we might call public culture, but I'm also interested in the relationship of the state or the government to that. One of the reasons I'm stealing this image of Frere is the phrase at the bottom, which again, Ned and other people will know, is that he's associated with this explosion of public architecture. So a museum, not just a collection of museum items in the Asiatic society. Public gardens, and I'll show you all pictures of these in a couple of minutes so you can visualize them, but I want to introduce them here as really the public works guru in many cases. And so we know that Birdwood's real interest was in what those buildings or institutions contained and making them accessible. He wasn't particularly interested in designing them. Even later on in life, traditional Indian architecture wasn't a particular interest to him. Art wares were. So very importantly, we have another kind of relationship between the person who's designing the physical space and the person who wants to fill that political space and where they can meet as far as usage and accessibility. So Frere will play a major role. Again, I need to apologize. I don't have access to his papers. They're not digitized yet. So when we all have a chance to travel, that will be one of my first expeditions And his papers are collected both in London and in Mumbai. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. One of the sources that has been very helpful, and again, I don't mean this in a silly, obvious way, but thankful to have the trust that I can get my metaphorical hands around most of Birdwood's publications. And these publications, not surprisingly, right, are connected to the societies, the learned societies, and connected to the institutions. So even though perhaps it's a little bit of the cart before the horse, I can go through these, see how the knowledge is organized, how it's labeled, and get some sense of what the institutional and public purposes were of these larger projects. So the two that have been most helpful, excuse me, I apologize, and probably hopeful as well, is this one that almost everybody is familiar with. And this is the first report of the first public museum in Mumbai. It is a transitional collection, as almost all of them are. There was a museum mania in British India in the 1850s and 1860s, like there was a museum mania in the Australasian colonies as well. And the steps of growth, the evolution, were pretty common. Collections were in a learned society, very limited controlled access. The learned society's collections moved to a public building, not always constructed with public funds. Sometimes private sponsors were necessary, but there was usually some title like Government Museum, Central Museum, Public Museum. So we see this in Sydney and other places as well. Eventually, it'll be moved to a larger central structure, quite often connected to a library, sometimes connected to a university, not always. And then, of course, when one has an opportunity to visit today, these institutions have almost always been renamed, echoing the name of a significant local figure. And that's the case as well in Mumbai. So when you go to visit what would have been Birdwood's collection, much of the collection is still there, but it's under the name of a public South Asian figure. One of my interests in this report is the effort to create a cultural center. So library, museum, and also gardens. Raising some interesting questions, not just I think for the big Victorians, but for us as well. All right, that sounds like a reasonable molecule. What about a university or research? And Birdwood is very careful to separate the university, which he also founded, from these institutions, which he founded. So first and foremost, we have this distinction between the role and purpose of a university and the role and purpose of these public cultural institutions. Having separated the purposes, right, the questions, of course, continue in that tense relationship we still have today between education and entertainment. I wouldn't say that George Birdwood was a barrel of laughs. He would have advocated education. And I think probably as he left Bombay in the boat, he would have expressed some concern that the gardens had become a festive place for a menagerie of odd and strange animals, and a place where one went walking for pleasure, not a place of botanical research. And that's a tension we see throughout the British Empire. The other, I think, interesting thing for me in a kind of anal way is to look at how the material world is labeled, how it's organized, what the reasons of its utility could be. And with Birdwood, it's quite clear that this is not really intended to be a universal collection. So it's not a mini British museum. It is a collection which is supposed to highlight what could be found around Bombay and the presidency, what is used manipulated, sold around Bombay and the presidency, and could therefore be traded or sold in almost a David Ricardo-esque comparative advantage way with other areas, including most specifically in India, Madras, for example, or Calcutta. But also when one goes to the Paris or London exhibitions, there's no attempt to say that Bombay is a mini London. Bombay has its own particular oils, rocks, artwares, and they should be traded and sold for other particular artwares. So we don't really have a universalist approach. Okay, second document, please. Thank you. This is his effort to catalog just one division of these products, which are so central to Bombay. If any of you step outside and there is a large charging elephant, you could probably throw this at that elephant and stop it in its tracks. It's over 350 to 360 pages of detailed, organized, labeled Bombay raw produce. Why does this interest me? Again, for a variety of reasons. One is obviously the distinction of vegetable produce, taking a medical approach to that. Secondly, the understanding that that division alone qualifies you for 350 pages. And then we shouldn't take the date as just being contingent or accidental. 1862 is the opening of the London International Exhibition, the next major English exhibition after the one you all know of, the Crystal Palace in 1851. So here's an attempt not just to explain Bombay to Bombay, but to explain Bombay to what for the time I think we could think of as a considerable internationalist audience. We all understand that these exhibitions were not replications of the United Nations, but for 1862, when one does look out, and if one were to include the colonies of major European powers, one would be rather impressed by the spread of internationalism. So it's another example of Birdwood thinking of Bombay in terms of the world, in terms of how exhibitions can be used to not just promote Bombay's particular products and understanding the material world, but also sell them overseas. This is too large, for example, to send as a PDF. So if you're interested, I'm happy to send you a couple of pages. It is quite the elephant stopper. But as I say, these two books have been very, very helpful in the way that, yes, all printed books can be of this type. Probably what would be most helpful if I could find the correspondence associated with these. And what I've found very helpful in the archives is to go through these types of books and texts and look at the handwritten notes. So for example, when I was working on exhibitions, there'd be handwritten notes about how the catalogs were incorrect, spelling, usage, etc. So I don't take this as an example of perfection. I take this as an example of an exhibition catalog sent by the date that the exhibition opened, which could mean, not surprisingly, there could be some mistakes. Okay, if I could see the next one, please. Thank you. So I have a few images from the time. I apologize. Again, they're not really great, but they'll give you some sense, particularly of the neoclassical style, which again will not surprise you, except we're not talking about neo-Gothic in this case. I'll show you one where they're combined. I wanted to give you a sense of the physicality for a couple reasons. I mean, this first image is of a central public building to which Birdwood wanted all the learned society's collections to be centralized and accessible in one spot. He picked an interesting time to make that recommendation, late 1857, early 1858. As you know, Bombay was relatively quote-unquote loyal, relatively quote-unquote passive, but is still the Sepoy Mutiny of the Great Indian Rebellion. So not surprisingly, when he tried to get rocks and antiquarian items like coins into the building, one of the charges back was, no, we actually need the space for weapons. As it turned out, coins won the day, and this was where the first non-Asiatic society public collection was. It was not in great shape. It would be like trying to use a library without card catalogs or files. So one of the first things he did as secretary was to laboriously organize the materials, label them, put them in drawers, which he thought of not just for research, but also for some kind of public accessibility. It's not mass accessibility. We're not talking the great exhibition, but in the debate in the society journals, he always came down on at least opening up the collection to those who pay membership in the society and lowering the cost of membership. So in his mind, at least, it was broader than the small group that had access before. So we are talking certainly about an elite culture. We're not talking about mass culture, but we're also not talking about where this story begins of a small group of people sitting around rocks, trying to label them, leaving them on the table, and then going to lunch and going on the rest of their lives. We're talking about trying to create a serious research center which would be accessible to dues-paying members who, as we'll talk about at the end, included a considerable number of South Asians. So in this case, we have his collections as really part of the public accessible building. Next image, please. Thank you. Then we move, and Ned will recognize this, then we move to our own building. This is a classic evolutionary repeated stage. We have our own building as the museum. So it won't have to compete with space for guns. It won't have to compete with space for land registration, legal petitions, etc. The style doesn't really merit too much conversation, as you could tell. Whether you like it or not, I probably would not blame Birdwood. As I said, he did not seem to have particular interest in the external structure. He was obviously interested in the internal because that meant how to organize and make accessible his collections. Next slide, please. Thanks. Thank you. I want to show you this because many of you already know about the rather famous Sassoon clock tower. So the David Sassoon family, which some of us have the good fortune to use to help our 3 or 4 remaining hairs look clean. This is just to give you a sense of replicating a public space. There's lots of literature on the tower, so I'm not going to either bore you with it or steal that material, but it's a good example of a prominent family in Mumbai or Bombay contributing to the development of this new public space. Again, this is written about in journals like the Bombay Builder, so there'll be a description of the clock tower, and once again, not surprisingly, it'll be associated with Governor Freer. Next image, thank you. This today is still the entrance to the gardens. Again, the idea of a garden associated with a museum, associated with a library, was not unusual. This does not make Birdwood unique by any means at all. It really makes him the opposite, typical of his mid-Victorian experts in public science and public culture. You could still go through this gate today when the pandemic is over. And if I can see the next slide, thank you. To what you'd see inside. This is a little later, but I wanted to show it because one could argue that Birdwood wasn't really successful with this plan. I don't know what would have happened if he had stayed, but I could say that if you look at the major public gardens in other South Asian cities, in Canadian, Australian cities, generally what were at least begun as rather serious research centers end up being far more serious sites of entertainment. And there are lots of good reasons, solid reasons for this. You know, they're macro reasons about changing ideas of socialization. There's a need, of course, to create some kind of garden space within these growing urban anti-natural spaces. I think there are plenty of reasons. I think it'd be a mistake to find one reason. But I wanted to show this to give you some sense that looking back, or looking from London in the 1870s, if Birdwood had reached back into his work in the 1860s, he would have been quite happy that there was diversity in the gardens, quite happy that Bombay's own indigenous flora were represented. But I think he would have been slightly miffed at the idea of going there for entertainment, going there to spend the day strolling with a friend, rather than doing research. This is a similar situation to many of the Australian scientists who I've studied. Trollope probably put it best. He said that the men of beautiful bushes have beaten the men of scientific shrubs. The beauty, yes.
Can I just jump in, because we had a question along the way, and she was hoping it could be answered now.
Absolutely.
Right in.
Absolutely.
This is from Monica Ghosh, and she's asking, I'm curious about Birdwood's Indian language knowledge, and if and how he relied on Indian experts' knowledge, and how that might have informed his
Yes. Great question, and one I need to pursue. I have not seen any evidence that he knew any South Asian languages. I have not. And the scientists he's working with are generally, obviously before 1857, 58, East India Company scientists. Afterwards, in London, it's a great question, and I'm glad you brought it up. And it's one of those things that all I can say right now is I see no evidence. And interestingly enough, in some of my other work, when I focused on the jousting between Kipling's father and Birdwood, that's essentially one of the older Kipling's complaints about Birdwood, that he only knew Bombay, and he really only knew English-speaking South Asian elites. So let me say thank you for the question. As of now, I would give you a tentative no, he did not. But it is on the checklist of things to look for. His publications are all in English, but that doesn't tell us, that tells us what the publishers are interested in. It's the kind of thing, though, that I think would be best answered by, again, going through his private correspondence, and I hope going through whatever papers are available for some of the South Asian gentlemen. They were men who he knew. Does that help, Monica? Monica there?
No, she won't be there. I'm passing the stuff on, but she's saying yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it's a great question.
Yeah, answered what she wanted. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So this is Bombay Victoria Gardens, almost like every other garden. If you had to choose between entertainment and education, it seems in later British world we moved much more towards entertainment. And there's lots of old work, as old as Craig and I are. We learned all about this in graduate school, about socialization, social control, and the movement from a Benthamite view to a more Arnoldian view. And in this case, again, it's not Birdwood and Mumbai as being something unusual. It's actually Birdwood and Mumbai being rather typical of the standard Victorian efforts. Okay, let me finish up with a couple and see if there's some more questions. If I can see the next image. Thanks. So sometimes those of us who spend our hours in front of screen, I kind of find a nugget. They find it late. This is a nugget that I need to decipher. I'm not going to use deconstruct. That's too sophisticated term for me. This is the laying of the stone, the ground stone for what would become the museum. So as I mentioned, it's moving the collection out of the Asiatic Society. It's creating what would be the Central Government Museum, which was almost immediately, not surprisingly, right, with the death of Albert, like so many other places, renamed Victoria and Albert. As you can see, there's a lot of work to be done there. This is Birdwood. He's got his uniform on, which you'll see, we saw in image number 2. And I don't think should be taken for granted a significant number of South Asian elites, with Governor Freer, of course, both giving the major speech and laying down the stone. So this will be one of the engravings and one of those historical moments, which would in part allow me to address Monica's point. The presentation and formal discussion was in English, right? But that doesn't mean what did not happen in behind the scenes or notes that were made here and there. And then the various participants trying to track down as many of those as I can. So in a sense, we have a series of these moments. The Illustrated London News reproduced a very similar engraving when the first stone was laid down for the Honolulu Cathedral at nearly the same time. These were obviously significant moments, and I had the very, very good fortune of having exactly one that I can work on. Okay, next image, and I'll finish up because I know people have places to be. Thanks. So the next two really go together, and you can show one and then the other, doesn't really make any difference. These, again, are little nuggets that in many of the public speeches and many of the writings, the names of the participating South Asians are listed. I think that this is interesting for a whole variety of reasons. Even almost regardless of what kind of a historian you are, it's fascinating to see these as the seeds, at least, for what became one of the most common lines in the obituaries for Birdwood. And that was, to paraphrase, he really knew India. And he really knew India because he really, quote unquote, knew Indians. Now, as banal as that sounds, I wanted to unpack that, particularly since that is written after 50 years in London, in which you could very easily refute those points. Whereas if you looked at Bombay, you could see the seeds for some arguments, the seeds for his understanding of how to know and construct colonial knowledge, his understanding of creating a cultural elite. And almost all these folks, as you can tell, in one way or another, gave money to one of these public institutions or were part of the Learned Society's board. So we're talking about a cultural elite. A cultural elite, though, that does cross racial and religious grounds. So, wavering in between the standard dismissal of that or the standard elevation of that, neither of which I want to get into. They both, I don't think, are necessarily very intellectually suggestive here. Again, trying to figure out what was going on. I mean, was Birdwood just interested in money? And there were not enough Anglo-Indians there, which is quite possible. Did, as Monica say, he have some linguistic interests? Were these folks also folks who gave scientific papers? And I have found some of them give scientific papers. So I am interested in looking at what that engraving could represent and filling in the captions of that engraving by going through lists like this. The next page as well, please. Thank you. Here's the final image. For another public project, again, the names of two well-known, well-positioned South Asians. So to conclude, first of all, thank you for your patience, and these really are baby steps, so I do appreciate the questions, like the language one from Monica. What I'm trying to do is figure out what happened with Birdwood and the meanings of what happened for a few trajectories. So one would be his career in life. So for interest in biography, why are these chapters of the biography missing? Could we explain that? Which is, I have some possible explanations. But by seeing them, see some trajectories, like the interest in medicine. So rather than separating the late Birdwood from the young Birdwood, I would find some continuities. Many folks are interested in the history of Orientalism, or the collection of texts and discourse about however you want to define the West defines however you want to define the East. and the significance of that in the late 19th, early 20th century, what kinds of seeds and contributions to Orientalism do we find here? And I would think among the most interesting would be that praising Birdwood, whether or not it's accurate praise, for on-the-ground experiential knowledge added to the textual knowledge provides a kind of interesting combination, right? Most Orientalists are appreciated for their textual knowledge. But here they're trying to kind of have it both ways, right? He has experiential and he has the textual. Thirdly, I see in Birdwood, and this is the most tentative of all the suggestions, but in a way the one that strikes me as, at least for me as a scholar, is most significant. I see a social imaginary in his traditionalism and in his Orientalism, an idea of how society should work. And I don't see such a gap where other people see a gap between the Birdwood of society in which native princes, artisans, village communities are necessarily so fundamentally different from a social imaginary of museums, learned societies, and relatively professional and mercantile South Asian elites. The two sound as if they should be non-congruent and have no connections. But what I'm working on is his vision of traditionalism, which I think really combines both. It's Bentham and it's Coleridge. It's institutions and it's organic connections. And I find in that kind of traditionalism, not absent the things we would expect, right? We would expect racialism, and it is there. We would expect some traditional Orthodox Orientalism, and it is there. We would expect some refutation of Macaulay. That's all there. But I'm interested in the whole package, and I want to take him seriously, and not as a systematic thinker, but as somebody whose suggestions about art and science and examinations present, if the pieces are put together, a social imaginary, which I think is at least worth giving some thought to. Anyhow, thank you very, very much. I appreciate your patience and your time. And I am more than happy to answer any questions. I'm more than happy to share the work. It really is a work in baby steps. So it's probably time to change the diaper and get up off the ground. But I certainly have enjoyed our little toddler time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. We got a couple of things that just came up right off the bat. The first thing was Monica had to apologize because she had to leave early.
Oh, of course.
But looking at your kernel or your nugget, what she said was that the names on there are mostly Parsis.
Yes.
Who functioned as middle people for the British and often were highly anglicized. So that's an interesting thing. And she sent you a private message to make
absolutely
a connection
right.
as far as that's
so
concerned.
If I could just answer without her absence,
yeah.
Absolutely right. And most of the references refer to that. So what interests me though is not just the intermediary, but sort of what they did. So they publicly sponsored these institutions by giving money, and they gave scientific papers. So again, it's not, I don't want to dismiss either, right? I don't want to say it was just an intermediary or just as a way for them to buy status. It is that, and it's other things as well. So I'm really interested, for example, in how much they gave, and I got to do some economic research, right, to figure out, what the values of these were in the time, right? Are they just token or not? And I'm very seriously interested in, and this gets back to the language question, these folks as scientists. Because as you know, we're moving that period away from respect for Indian medicine and science, right, towards its dismissal, okay, towards its replacement. And folks who've studied David Arnold and stuff know about it. And I'm interested in all that, but I want to give a laser-like example of how that might work. So I'd be interested in, what the Parsi gentleman referred to as their scientific sources. So I have a lot of work, and she's absolutely right. And to double on what she said, the literature does recognize them as such. It'll say, you know, Parsi professional gentleman or mercantile member of the Parsi community. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
What you're just saying there actually feeds directly into Ned's question, which is, he says, thanks, Peter, interesting stuff. On the Elephant Stopper document, one of Birdwood's titles is Professor of Materia Medica, Grant Medical College.
Yes.
Have you come across anything about this aspect of his participation in Bombay public intellectual life?
Absolutely, very important. And I mentioned in the written version, I didn't really give it enough time here, but in a way, Ned's found exactly the alpha and the omega. I take very seriously. If you look at how his name is listed in DNB, or if you look at the later obituaries, it always mentions his medical training in Edinburgh. It always mentions he was a professor, and then it ends. So Ned, I take it very serious, and I think, in fact, it formed a worldview more than people recognize. I look at it as a little engine that got the train going. And I also think that the way he visualizes the Indian industrial art world has a lot of connections to this. Now, as far as the practical aspects, and Ned's absolutely right, I got to get into their archives. I just haven't, right? So I would like to see, for example, if we have lecture notes, right? If we have correspondence, absolutely essential. And all I can say now is really an assertion, and it may be entirely wrong. So my assertion is that this often neglected or just recognized in a token way aspect of his not only got him to Bombay, right? He came as with the medical service, but I think influenced the way he approached the physical world, even when that physical world was comprised of non-scientific, seemingly non-scientific material world like Indian artwork. So I agree entirely, and it's really a matter of getting to the archives.
I'm going to jump in. I want to mention that Shauna Brown has also said, thank you very much, Peter. It's really fascinating material. Not a question there, just a compliment.
Thank you. Always appreciate those. Yep.
I wanted to follow up. This is sort of the life writing dimension, but it's something a larger fascination for me. How old was he when he actually went back to England the first time? When did they send him?
So back to England the first time, he was grade school age. I have to find the exact age. He schooled there and went to medical school. I'll find out the exact age. Probably the standard Anglo-Indian kind of age, but I will find out the exact one. Yeah.
Yeah. And what school did he go to? Where did they?
So I need to research all of that.
Okay.
And I will say, even though it's no excuse, I'm interested in the Bombay years, so I sort of just introduced. But those are important questions. Medical school was in Edinburgh.
Now, as far as
I'm sure the obituaries list his grade school. I just didn't include it, but I will add that.
Yeah, I'm just interested because some of the people I know, people like Thackeray or whatever, he ended up at Charterhouse, and they often ended up at the sort of major, and it often told you what kind of status they had in India,
right.
What schools they ended up at.
No, that's very, very important. I was a little myopic because you could write a book about what he does after 1870, and I tried to distill that down to 3.5 pages. So no, that's important. What I don't see though are, if he had stayed in England, there'd be references to schoolmates and things. I mean, he comes back to Mumbai or Bombay as a child of an Anglo-Indian, as clearly second generation, and that plus the medical experience that Ned mentioned seemed to be two very important openings for him. Right, being a professor. Well, first of all, being on the naval vessel. I mean, the guy arrives, the Gazette listens at having arrived, and within like 3 hours he's on the boat. He's already in war. Okay, it's not a particular. It's a short war. Well, no war is short, but I mean, we're not talking about the magnitude, of course, of the Afghan War or the rebellion or mutiny. And we don't hear much about it other than a line. But then he slips into his professorship. I do think, though, apropos of what Monica was asking, there were Parsi participants at the medical school. And I think that's an interesting connection. Again, I got to get to the records. But there are various references to people, to South Asians he knew at the medical school. Now, what they did, I have to see. Students, professors, funders. I'm not sure exactly what they did. And again, I need to get into that more specifically. Okay. I think probably, I'm not really thinking about articles, but if I could get the archival material, I think probably his association with the medical school alone would be an article. Right. But again, it's getting to the sources. So I have to, I confess to curiosity, but I also confess to not really having the answers.
One other thing, this is just a general question, which ties into, I think, a lot of the other things that you're talking about. At least from our terms, right? He gets there when he's 20. He's gone by the time he's 36. So right. The entire time when he's involved in all this institution building and that kind of thing, he's really a very young man. But a lot of them were. And so I was just wondering, what does that suggest about sort of their placement in these situations? Because these people at a very young age are suddenly wielding, huge resources and huge access to institution building and various other things.
Right. So I think there are a couple potential answers for that. One of the answers could be his relationship with the governor, which is one of the reasons I need to, pursue that. I mean, really can't imagine Cole without Albert. It just really isn't a Henry Cole. All right. And Cole is right, not a particularly popular or likable character. And when he starts, he's not that old. So part of the answer to the question is whether or not, like Maggie Thatcher surrounded herself with young, bright men. Was this one of Freer's young, the young kindergarten we were talking about with Milner? Was this, Bombay kindergarten? So I need to pursue that. Secondly, it's also quite clear from the learned societies that he had a kind of writ de passage. So again, I couldn't mention this, I apologize, because you only have a certain number of minutes, but his first publication is, from my view, a kind of rite of passage. He is asked to review a book by a noted local geologist who is also the secretary of one of the learned societies, as kind of a test case, right? I mean, to me, it would seem, kind of a test case. Again, I'd have to get the actual contract, etc. But it would seem to me, guys, gung-ho guy, he knows what he's talking about, but let's kind of see how much he really knows. And he reviews Carter's book on geology, which was influential in time and place, writes a review. The review is well received by the local newspaper, and pretty soon he's replacing Carter as the secretary of the society. Not to throw out the king, but because, in fact, Carter is old enough to retire. So I read that in partial to answer your question. Well, that was kind of a rite of passage, right? Here's the young buck. We're going to give him a serious work to review. Does he know his stuff? He does know his stuff. And I would also say that Birdwood could be very nasty, but like all people who rise in society, he knew when not to be. So everybody knows the famous 1910 dismissal of Indian fine arts as suet pudding. Yeah. That's probably his most famous and nasty. But I have a feeling in Bombay, from what I've been able to see, I don't know what happened in medical school, right? As a professor, maybe he wasn't this way. But he seemed pretty good about negotiating the circles. So again, to kind of answer your question, he's young. I think in Anglo-Indian circles, though, and Ned could correct me, being associated with a well-respected father, which his dad was. His father's in a lot of the literature, the military respect, I mean. Right. I don't think that hurt him. He wasn't kind of the nasty Barry Lyndon son. He was the dutiful Anglo-Indian son. So I think all those things help answer your question about being young, fresh off the boat. I think another answer, and I don't think it's irrelevant, is it's not as competitive a community. It's not like trying to be secretary in London or even Calcutta, where the Royal Asiatic Society starts, right? Branch. It's a smaller community. It's not a whole number, less than 5, But we are talking about a kind of opportunity that somebody could have. And it seems to me that the East India Office took it seriously enough so that, he gets this not insignificant position as an assistant to Watson almost immediately. So that's kind of the network, right? Working through the network where whatever he'd done as a young man had some street cred. And I think the exhibitions helped that. I mean, you contribute the catalog, you're president of the exhibition, people like Watson meet you at the exhibition, they read your materials. That doesn't hurt. So does that help answer a little bit?
I'm just thinking really quickly, and then I want to move to another question quickly, but I'm just thinking that that's symptomatic all over the place. For example, William Hillebrand, who came here, arrived here at the age of 30, and within 3 years, he was the royal physician to Kamehameha IV and Queen Emma. He started the Queen's Hospital. He was also involved in the Royal Hawaii Botanical Society, did the 2-year trip, brought us virtually all of the birds and the animals and the plants that are here now, had a major correspondence with Kew Botanical Gardens, and within 20 years he'd done that and then was gone.
Right.
I'm going to put Ned's question.
Where did he go? Where did he go?
Oh, he went back to Germany. He was traveling through, but before that, even in his early 20s, he was in Australia. There's 2 plants there named after him. He was an obsessive botanist, but he was also a doctor. And those 2 things together, basically any place he walked in, he immediately became the major person in that area, even though he was a very young man. I'm going to put a couple of Ned's questions together here.
Sure.
Thanks for allowing us to travel to Bombay during the pandemic, Peter, even if to the mid-19th century. I love the gardens, and the refurbishment of the museum in recent years was well done. You mentioned that Birdwood would shake his head in despair at the addition of a zoo to the Victoria Gardens. Did he have a role in its establishment or cataloging, or was his interest limited to horticulture and agriculture and not to animals? And then last one, and I promise, and related to a question that John Zerns asked on caste, which it would also be good to have your response on.
Okay, very good.
The sketch of laying the foundation stone with its array of elite Bombay life, along with the list of prominent Indians on the museum board, is reminiscent of a gallery in the museum, which is an ethnological array of various cultural groups represented in their traditional dress. Did Birdwood extend his studies in the Bombay years to categorizing Indian and social cultural groups? Thanks for the presentation, Peter. So if you could address the issues of animals, if you could address the issue of ethnography, and if you could address the issue of caste.
Perfect. Okay. Animals. He does not seem to have, from what I can tell, again, remember, we're sort of at the beginning of this, he has zero interest in animals that I can tell. He's pretty widespread about other things. I mean, he even gets a little bit into antiquarianism. Certainly coins, rocks, plants, oils, seeds. I cannot see anything that he has interest in related to a zoo, for example, or the menagerie that shows up. My comment about his looking back in anger wasn't so much the animals as the entertainment value, that the gardens had become a source of leisure, not a source of research. So he even differentiates between a university and the gardens. Gardens are where you do research, universities where you're taught. So that's my sense of that. And he did advocate for the gardens, but leaves by 1868. So a lot of what we know of developing the gardens occurs in the 1870s and 1880s. I will look for animals. I don't see much interest about them. There's a connection later on in his life where he's one of the most outspoken critics of Kipling's father's book on animals in India. But when you read it, read Birdwood's criticism, there's nothing scientific or knowledgeable about the animals, right? So he doesn't go along and say Kipling doesn't understand the physiology of the animal or doesn't understand the environment of the animal. So my sense is he didn't have a lot of interest in physical animals. One connection might be, though it's worth pursuing, is obviously some of the botanical samples could be animal feed. And certainly if you go to an exhibition in India, right, and there's such interest when there's cattle disease and such in preserving cattle, that could be a potential interest. My sense, though, that would be more commercial than scientific. So does that help? Is Ned still on? I can't tell.
Yeah, he's there. We'll see if he types something in.
Okay. Caste. Yes, very big later on. Major in Birdwood's defense, for example, of Indian village communities, quote unquote, Indian artisans. Very much his social imaginary is very connected to those traditionalist categories. What interests me is whether or not those have some connections in the way he envisions society works with his earlier understanding of how Bombay works. So let me say yes to a later interest. There's not a lot in the language about Bombay as far as caste goes, but I will continue to look. My interest is in the continuity between the caste view and what would be a somewhat Macaulay-esque view. In other words, my interest is in social structure, the existence of particular elites and classes, not necessarily how they are garbed or represented. Okay, John, does that help?
John's moved on, but that works
Okay,
fine.
okay. So if you Googled caste in Birdwood, you'd find a lot of connections later on. Okay, what ethnography? Great question, because Watson, his superior and employer at the India office, is fascinated by ethnography, and many of you will know his photographic album. I can't remember the exact title, but something like Illustration of Indian Types or something like that. I don't think that Birdwood doesn't show much interest in ethnography, other than you could say, and I think with some reason, that when he starts looking at different groups connected to different types of traditional art later on, you could see that almost as an ethnographic taxonomy. I mean, some castes and some ethnic groups do this kind of art. Other castes and other ethnic groups do this kind of art. But I don't find with Birdwood, say, for example, phrenology or the measuring of skulls. He doesn't seem interested in those not uncommon ethnographic tableau at shows, or even necessarily getting Indian artisans to come to shows. That is one of the interesting things, right? Because you would think somebody who is extolled about these social relations would have some interest in the humanity of these figures. Okay, does that help, whoever asked that?
Yeah, and that actually works well. And John Zern was actually still here. So thank you for the answer on caste. Clem Guthrow says, thank you, Peter. Great presentation. That finishes the questions. I actually just goofed around a little bit there and found out that he went to the Plymouth Grammar School.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thanks.
So he was in Plymouth, apparently. And I would just like to have everybody join me in thanking Peter for his presentation and, as Ned said, taking us to Bombay for a little while. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, particularly this busy time. I hope everybody stays safe. My offer was not an idle offer. If you have any interest, particularly in the sources, I think the printed version is most important for the citations. If any of you are interested, I'm more than happy to. And I look forward to the spring brown bags.
Great.
Let me give you a little shout out to the brown bag. It was valuable when we were all together, and it's even more valuable when we're not all together. It's a really wonderful opportunity to meet and chat. So thank you all very much. Enjoy late lunch and be safe.